The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of London as Thomas Mitchell wheeled his chair slowly through the historic streets. At 63 years old, his weathered hands gripped the wheels with the same determination that had carried him through 25 years of military service. The Union Jack pin on his worn jacket caught the light as he navigated the familiar route he had taken every year for the past decade. Thomas had served in the British Army with distinction, completing tours in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, and Afghanistan. His service record was exemplary: commendations for bravery, leadership awards, and the deep respect of every soldier who had served under his command. He had been a company sergeant major, responsible for the lives and welfare of over 100 men and women. The weight of that responsibility had shaped him into the man he was today. His final deployment had changed everything. The patrol that October morning in Helmand Province had started like any other. Thomas was leading a routine inspection of a village school that his unit had been helping to rebuild. The children had rushed out to greet them, their faces bright with excitement at seeing the British soldiers who brought books and supplies. It was in that moment of joy and hope that the improvised explosive device detonated. The blast had killed 3 of his soldiers instantly. Private Danny Wilson was just 19 years old and 2 weeks away from going home to meet his newborn daughter, Corporal Sarah Jenkins, who had been planning to propose to her girlfriend when she returned, and Lance Corporal Michael O'Brien, whose infectious laugh had kept morale high during the darkest moments of their deployment. Thomas had been thrown 20 feet by the explosion, his legs crushed beneath falling debris. The months that followed in the military hospital were a blur of surgeries, rehabilitation attempts, and the gradual realization that he would never walk again. But the physical injuries paled in comparison to the psychological wounds. The guilt of surviving when his soldiers hadn't eaten away at him. He replayed that morning thousands of times, wondering if he could have done something different, if he could have saved them. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. The Veterans Affairs Office had processed his paperwork with cold efficiency, offering compensation packages and disability benefits. But no amount of money could fill the void left by losing his career, his mobility, and his brothers in arms. The Army had been his life for over 2 decades, and suddenly he was just another disabled veteran, forgotten by a society that preferred to think of soldiers as heroes in parades, rather than broken men struggling with invisible wounds. For months after his medical discharge, Thomas had barely left his small flat in South London. Depression wrapped around him like a heavy blanket, making even the simplest tasks feel impossible. He would sit for hours staring at photographs from his deployments, at the faces of soldiers who had trusted him to bring them home safely. The guilt was overwhelming, crushing him with its weight. His wife Margaret had been his anchor during those dark days. The nurse by profession, she understood trauma and healing in ways that allowed her to be patient when Thomas raged against his limitations, gentle when he broke down in tears, and firm when he needed to be pushed toward recovery. She would sit beside his bed during the worst nights, reading letters from his old unit, sharing news from their daughter Sarah, who lived in Australia with her family and was pregnant with their first grandchild. Margaret had also been the one to contact other veterans organizations, connecting Thomas with men and women who understood his struggle. Slowly, with Margaret's patient encouragement and the support of other veterans who had walked similar paths, Thomas began to rebuild his life piece by piece. He learned to navigate his wheelchair, to adapt his home, and most importantly, to find new purpose in supporting other veterans facing their own battles. The idea for his annual pilgrimage to Buckingham Palace had come from his old Sergeant Major, Bill Thompson, who visited one afternoon with a bottle of single malt whiskey and some hard truths that only an old soldier could deliver. "You think sitting in that chair makes you less of a soldier?" he had asked, his gruff voice thick with emotion. "Those guards standing out there, they're standing for every man and woman who wore the uniform. That includes you, Mitchell. Those lads you lost, they'd want you to remember them properly, not waste away feeling sorry for yourself." The conversation had lasted until dawn, 2 old soldiers sharing memories, tears, and eventually a sense of renewed purpose. Bill had helped Thomas understand that honoring the dead meant living fully, not disappearing into grief and guilt. So, Thomas had started coming to the palace every year on October 15th, the anniversary of the attack. It's not to wallow in self-pity, but to honor the memory of Danny, Sarah, and Michael, the 3 soldiers who hadn't made it home from that patrol. He would dress in his best clothes, pin on his medals, and sit quietly in his wheelchair, watching the changing of the guard ceremony. In those moments, he felt connected once again to the brotherhood he thought he had lost forever. Over the years, the ritual had become sacred to him. He would arrive early, position himself at the same spot along the palace railings, and spend the morning remembering his fallen comrades. He would tell them about Margaret's health, about Sarah's children growing up in Sydney, about the other veterans he was helping through their own struggles. It was his way of keeping them alive, of ensuring their sacrifice meant something. Today felt different somehow. As Thomas positioned himself in his usual spot along the palace railings, he noticed the crowd seemed more subdued than usual. Perhaps it was the gray clouds gathering overhead, threatening rain. Or maybe he was just more aware of the weight of his memories on this particular anniversary. A decade had passed since the attack, and the pain had evolved from sharp agony to a dull ache that never quite went away. He adjusted his military beret, the same one he had worn as a company sergeant major, and straightened his medals carefully. Each ribbon told a story. Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Afghanistan. It's a long service and good conduct medal that represented a lifetime of dedication. These medals weren't just decorations. They were testament to a life lived in service to something greater than himself. As he waited for the ceremony to begin, Thomas was unaware that this day would become one he would never forget. That a simple act of recognition from a young soldier would change not only his life, but touch the hearts of people around the world. Lance Corporal James Harrison stood at attention in his scarlet tunic and tall bearskin hat. His rifle held perfectly steady despite the morning chill. At 24, he was one of the youngest members of the Queen's Guard, but his dedication to duty was absolute. The tourists pressed against the barriers, cameras clicking constantly, trying to get the perfect shot or provoke some reaction from the stoic sentries. James had learned early in his posting to look through the crowd rather than at them. His training had taught him to maintain the 1,000-yard stare that made the guards seem like living statues. But today, something kept drawing his attention to an older man in a wheelchair positioned near the corner of the palace railings. Unlike the other spectators who chatted loudly and pointed at the guards, this man sat in respectful silence. His military bearing was unmistakable, even seated. The way he held his shoulders, the careful arrangement of medals on his jacket, the precise angle of his beret, everything about him spoke of a lifetime of service. James noticed the man wasn't taking pictures or trying to catch the guard's attention. He simply watched with the quiet dignity of someone who understood the solemnity of the ceremony. During his brief moments of authorized movement, James caught glimpses of the wheelchair-bound veteran. He saw how the man's eyes followed the precise drill movements, how he subtly nodded approval at particularly sharp turns or perfect formations. There was something profoundly moving about this silent appreciation from someone who clearly knew what it meant to serve. As the morning progressed, James learned more about his duties from observing his senior colleagues. He had been warned during training about maintaining protocol, about the importance of remaining impassive regardless of what happened around him. The guard's reputation for unwavering discipline was legendary, and any breach of protocol could result in serious consequences. Yet something about the veteran's presence stirred, something deep within James. His own grandfather had served in World War II, and James had grown up hearing stories of courage, sacrifice, and the bonds formed between soldiers. Looking at this man, he saw echoes of those stories, a living reminder of the price some paid for their service to country. The crowd began to shift and murmur as the official changing of the guard ceremony approached. James straightened his already perfect posture and prepared for the formal proceedings. But his eyes kept returning to the quiet figure in the wheelchair, and he found himself wondering about the man's story, about the battles he had fought, and the sacrifices he had made. Little did James know that his growing awareness of the veteran would soon lead him to make a decision that would touch hearts around the world. The changing of the guard ceremony began with its usual precision and pageantry, a ritual that had remained virtually unchanged for centuries. The household division band struck up the familiar martial music that had echoed through these same streets since the reign of Charles II. The sound of brass instruments and drums filled the morning air, creating an atmosphere of solemnity and national pride that never failed to move both participants and spectators. Thomas felt his heart swell with the old pride as he watched the immaculate formations march past, their movements synchronized to perfection. The red-coated guards moved as one entity, their black bearskin hats creating an imposing silhouette against the gray London sky. Every step was measured, every turn executed with mathematical precision, every rifle movement coordinated down to the split second. From his position at the railings, Thomas had a clear view of the entire proceedings. He had memorized every aspect of the ceremony over his many visits, could predict each movement before it happened, knew exactly when the band would play each piece. But familiarity had never bred contempt. If anything, his appreciation had deepened with each viewing. The discipline on display reminded him of his own military training, of the countless hours spent on parade grounds perfecting drill movements that seemed pointless to young recruits but built the foundation of military bearing and teamwork. He remembered the pride he had felt during his own ceremonial duties early in his career, wearing the dress uniform of his regiment, representing something larger than himself, as the new guard took their positions with ritualistic precision. Each movement crisp and purposeful. Thomas noticed one particular soldier who seemed different from the others. While all the guards maintained their stoic expressions and rigid posture with professional excellence, this young man appeared to be paying special attention to the crowd. More specifically, Thomas realized with growing surprise and curiosity. The soldier seemed to be looking in his direction. The observation was subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed the slight shift in the guard's gaze, the way his attention seemed to linger on Thomas's section of the crowd. But Thomas's military experience had taught him to read body language, to notice the small details that revealed what people were thinking beneath their composed exteriors. The ceremony concluded with the traditional musical finale, the departing guard marching away with the same precision they had maintained throughout their duty. Most of the crowd began to disperse immediately afterward, chattering excitedly about what they had witnessed, comparing photographs, and consulting guidebooks about their next tourist destination. Street vendors emerged from nearby corners calling out their wares, postcards, miniature guards, hats, Union Jack souvenirs, and hot tea to warm visitors on the cool morning. Tour guides gathered their groups like shepherds collecting their flocks, pointing toward Westminster Abbey or the London Eye as the next stops on carefully planned itineraries. The normal bustle of London. Life resumed around the palace gates with remarkable speed. Double-decker buses rumbled past, black taxis honked their horns, and pedestrians hurried along sidewalks with the purposeful stride of people late for important appointments. Within minutes, it was as if the ceremony had never happened. But Thomas remained in his spot, as was his custom. This was his time for quiet reflection, for remembering his fallen comrades and honoring their memory in the silence that followed the pageantry. He didn't need crowds or ceremony for this part. It was intensely personal. A conversation with ghosts that only he could hear. He closed his eyes briefly and spoke silently to Danny, Dada, and Michael, telling them about the ceremony they had just witnessed, sharing details about his life and Margaret's health, updating them on the other veterans he had been helping. This annual ritual had become his way of keeping them alive in his heart, ensuring their sacrifice continued to have meaning. The palace guards had returned to their posts, once again becoming the silent sentinels that drew millions of visitors each year from around the world. They stood like statues, unmoving and impassive, representing centuries of British military tradition and the unwavering dedication of those who served. Thomas watched them with professional appreciation, noting their bearing, their alertness. Despite the rigid formality of their duties, the way they managed to remain vigilant while appearing completely still. He thought about his own time on ceremonial duties early in his career, for the operational deployments that would eventually cost him his legs and change his life forever. Those early days seemed like a lifetime ago. Young Thomas Mitchell, full of ambition and pride, standing at attention in dress uniform, believing he was invincible and that his service would always be honored and remembered. The innocence of those days felt both precious and painful now, a reminder of how much he had lost along the way, lost in these memories. Thomas almost didn't notice when one of the guards began to move. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in position, barely perceptible to the casual observer. Then a slight turn of the head, breaking the rigid posture that was supposed to be maintained at all times. Then, to Thomas's absolute amazement and disbelief, the young guard he had noticed earlier began to walk directly toward him. This was unprecedented in Thomas's decade of attending these ceremonies. He had never seen a guard break from their post to approach a member of the public, had never witnessed any deviation from the strict protocols that govern their behavior. The movement was deliberate and dignified, not hurried or uncertain. The guard's steps were measured and purposeful, each one carrying him closer to Thomas's position at the railings. Other tourists had noticed the unusual behavior and were beginning to point and whisper, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The crowd around Thomas began to take notice as well. Conversations stopping mid-sentence, cameras being raised instinctively, and a hush falling over the immediate area like a blanket. Everyone sensed that they were about to witness something significant, though none could predict exactly what was about to happen. Thomas felt his pulse quicken as the red-coated figure drew closer, his heart beginning to race with a mixture of anticipation and bewilderment. The soldier's movements were deliberate and dignified despite the clear breach of normal protocol, suggesting this was not an impulsive decision but a carefully considered action. What could this young guard possibly want? Had Thomas done something wrong? Is there some security concern? Or is something else entirely driving this unprecedented approach? The questions raced through Thomas's mind as the distance between them continued to shrink, the moment growing more surreal with each passing second. Lance Corporal James Harrison knew he was about to break one of the most fundamental rules of his duty, and the weight of that decision pressed down on him with each step he took. The Queen's Guard were not supposed to interact with the public, under any circumstances, certainly not to leave their posts without explicit authorization from their commanding officer. His heart pounded beneath his scarlet tunic, like a drum, each beat echoing in his ears as he walked purposefully toward the elderly veteran in the wheelchair. The training he had received had been crystal clear on this point. Months of instruction had drilled into him and his fellow guards the absolute necessity of maintaining their stoic demeanor and rigid adherence to protocol. Any deviation could result in immediate disciplinary action, potential reassignment, or even discharge from the prestigious unit. These weren't empty threats. James knew of guards who had been removed from duty for far lesser infractions, but something deeper than duty regulations was driving him forward, something that spoke to the very core of why he had joined the military in the first place. As he had watched Thomas throughout the morning, observing the veteran's quiet dignity and respectful attention to the ceremony, James had felt a growing conviction that some things transcended rules and regulations. Here was a man who had clearly given everything for his country, who continued to honor his service and his fallen comrades despite his own tremendous losses and ongoing struggles. The medals on his chest weren't decoration. They were testament to sacrifice, courage, and dedication that deserved recognition from a fellow soldier. James thought about his grandfather's stories, about the bonds between soldiers that transcended rank, age, and circumstance. Robert Harrison had often told him that the greatest honor a soldier could receive wasn't a medal or commendation, but the respect and acknowledgement of his brothers in arms. It's not the politicians or generals who understand what you've done, he had said. It's the man standing next to you who knows what it cost. The crowd parted instinctively as James approached, visitors stepping aside without fully understanding what they were witnessing, but sensing the gravity and significance of the moment. The normal chatter and noise of tourist activity faded to whispers, then to complete silence as more people noticed the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. Tourists stopped taking photographs, children stopped chattering and pointing, and even the street vendors paused in their calling to watch this extraordinary breach of centuries-old protocol. The only sounds were the distant rumble of London traffic, the soft scrape of James's polished boots on the pavement, and the barely audible whispers of spectators wondering what was about to happen. James was acutely aware of the cameras now, trained on him, of the phones being raised to record what everyone seemed to sense was a historic moment. Social media would explode within hours, he realized, and his actions would be scrutinized by millions of people around the world. The thought was both terrifying and oddly liberating. Whatever consequences followed, at least his gesture would be witnessed and understood. Thomas looked up in wonder and growing emotion as the tall figure in the iconic red tunic and massive bearskin hat came to a stop directly in front of his wheelchair. For a moment, neither man moved or spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with significance and mutual recognition. James looked down into eyes that had seen combat, that had witnessed the loss of friends and comrades, that carried the weight of service and sacrifice that few civilians could ever truly comprehend. These were eyes that had seen young soldiers take their first steps into adulthood and their last steps on earth. Eyes that held the memories of battles fought and prices paid. Thomas looked up at a young face that reminded him powerfully of his own soldiers, of the men and women he had led and loved like family. He saw in James's expression the same dedication and sense of duty that had driven Thomas's own service, the same willingness to put something larger than himself above personal comfort or safety in that moment of eye contact. Decades of military tradition and shared experience created a bridge between them. They were separated by generation, by different conflicts and different challenges, but united by the common bond of service and the understanding of what it truly meant to wear the uniform. Then, with deliberate precision that would have impressed his drill instructors, Lance Corporal Harrison brought his rifle to the present arms position and executed a perfect military salute. Every movement was textbook perfect. The angle of his arm, the position of his hand, the straightness of his back, the timing of the gesture. But this wasn't just a ceremonial salute performed by rote. This was a salute that acknowledged not just rank or ceremony, but one soldier's heartfelt recognition of another's service and sacrifice. It was a salute that said, "I see you. I honor your sacrifice. You are not forgotten. Your service matters." The gesture carried with it the weight of military tradition stretching back centuries, the respect of one warrior for another, and the acknowledgement that some bonds transcend all barriers of age, rank, and circumstance. In that simple raising of his hand, James was speaking for every soldier who had ever served, honoring not just Thomas, but every veteran who had given parts of themselves for their country. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever, the entire world holding its breath as witnesses to this extraordinary moment. Thomas felt tears well up in his eyes, emotions overwhelming him as he slowly raised his right hand to return the salute. His movement wasn't as crisp as it once had been, his arm shaking slightly with age and the weight of memory. But it carried decades of military bearing and undiminished pride. The simple gesture created a bridge across generations, across different conflicts and different wars, across the visible and invisible wounds of service. For that moment, Thomas wasn't a disabled veteran forgotten by society. He was a soldier being honored by a brother in arms. His sacrifice acknowledged and his service remembered. Around them, the watching crowd began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't a breach of protocol for its own sake, but an act of profound respect and recognition. Cell phone cameras began to record quietly, respectfully, capturing a moment that would touch hearts around the world. Even the most casual observers seemed to sense that they were seeing something special, something that spoke to deeper values of honor, duty, and human dignity. But quietly, respectfully. Even the most casual observers seemed to sense that they were seeing something special, something that spoke to deeper values of honor, duty, recognition. James held his salute for a full 10 seconds before slowly returning to attention. The formal exchange was complete, but its impact would resonate far beyond this moment. Without a word, he turned sharply on his heel and marched back to his post, knowing that he would likely face consequences for his actions, but feeling absolutely certain that he had done the right thing. The moment the mutual salute ended, Thomas felt as though a weight he had carried for years had been lifted from his shoulders. The young guard's recognition had done something that no amount of therapy or well-meaning sympathy had achieved. It had restored his sense of belonging to the military family he thought he had lost. As Lance Corporal Harrison returned to his post, several people in the crowd approached Thomas. An elderly woman touched his arm gently and simply said, "Thank you for your service." A young father lifted his small daughter so she could see Thomas's medals up close, explaining in hushed tones about the brave men and women who protect their country. A group of American tourists, clearly moved by what they had witnessed, asked respectfully if they could shake his hand. But it was the reaction of other veterans in the crowd that affected Thomas most deeply. A man about his own age, wearing a Royal Navy cap, wheeled over and introduced himself. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen anything like it." Soon, several other former servicemen and women had gathered around Thomas, sharing their own stories and expressing their appreciation for what had just occurred. Word of the extraordinary. Salute began to spread even before Thomas left the palace grounds. People who had recorded the moment on their phones were already sharing it with friends and family. Social media posts began appearing with captions like, "This is what respect looks like, and a moment that will restore your faith in humanity." Thomas himself remained largely unaware of the digital storm brewing around him. He was still processing the emotional impact of the young guard's gesture. As he slowly made his way home, stopping occasionally to rest and reflect, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. The ceremony had always been meaningful to him, but this year had been transformative. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Lance Corporal Harrison was dealing with the immediate consequences of his actions. His sergeant major had witnessed the entire exchange and summoned him for an immediate debriefing. James stood at attention in the guard room, prepared to accept whatever punishment awaited him. "Do you understand what you've done, Harrison?" the sergeant major asked, his expression unreadable. "Yes, sir." "Oh." "I broke protocol by leaving my post and interacting with a member of the public." "And why did you do it?" James considered his answer carefully. "Because he deserved it, sir. That man has clearly given everything for his country, and he comes here every year to pay his respects. I felt it was the right thing to do." The sergeant major studied the young soldier for a long moment before speaking again. "You're absolutely right, lad. It was the right thing to do. Now let's see if we can convince the brass of that when they start asking questions." Within hours of Thomas returning home to his modest flat in South London, his daughter Sarah was calling from Sydney, Australia, her voice filled with excitement and tears. The video of the salute had already traveled around the world, shared thousands of times across every social media platform, reaching corners of the internet that Thomas never knew existed. "Dad, you're famous." Sarah laughed through her emotions as they spoke on the video call that Margaret had helped set up. "The whole world is talking about what happened today. I'm so proud of you, and I know Mum would be too." Margaret had passed away 2 years earlier, a loss that had devastated Thomas and nearly sent him back into the depression he had fought so hard to overcome. But today, for the first time since her funeral, he felt her presence strongly, as if she were sitting beside him, squeezing his hand and whispering her pride in his ear. Thomas was bewildered by the global attention his simple moment of recognition had generated. His old mobile phone, which rarely rang except for doctor's appointments and the occasional call from Sarah, is now buzzing constantly with calls from journalists, television producers, and well-wishers from around the world. The story had captured something universal about human dignity, respect, the bonds that connect people across generations and circumstances. Comments poured in from veterans in America, Australia, Canada, and dozens of other countries, each sharing their own stories of service, sacrifice, and the profound impact of being seen and acknowledged. The media response was overwhelmingly positive, a rare moment of unity in an often divided world. Veterans organizations praised both Thomas and Lance Corporal Harrison, noting that while the Guard had technically broken protocol, he had upheld the deeper values that the ceremony represented. Military historians pointed out that the most important traditions were not the rigid rules of procedure, but the underlying principles of honor, duty, mutual respect Social media was flooded with similar stories from other veterans who had felt forgotten or overlooked, sharing their own experiences of struggle and the profound impact of recognition. The hashtag salute to service began trending worldwide, with people posting photos of their own family members who had served, sharing stories of sacrifice, and expressing gratitude for those who had worn the uniform. For Lance Corporal Harrison, the consequences were far different from what he had expected when he made his spontaneous decision to honor Thomas. Rather than facing disciplinary action or dismissal, he found himself commended by his superiors, praised by military leadership, and celebrated as an example of the best traditions of military service. The palace, after initially expressing concern about the breach of protocol, released a statement within 24 hours that fully supported the young soldier's actions. The official response acknowledged that while procedures existed for important reasons, there were moments when the human values behind those procedures took precedence. The actions of Lance Corporal Harrison demonstrated the finest traditions of military service, the statement read. His recognition of a fellow soldier's sacrifice embodied the respect and honor that all veterans deserve. The palace fully supports his decision and commends him for his compassion and judgment. Military leadership, rather than punishing James, began using his story as an example of the kind of character they wanted to see in modern soldiers: technical competence combined with human compassion, adherence to duty balanced with moral courage. A week after the incident, Thomas received an invitation that left him speechless and overwhelmed with emotion. He was invited to a special ceremony at Buckingham Palace, where he would meet with senior military officials and receive formal recognition for his years of service and his dignity in the face of tremendous adversity. Lance Corporal Harrison would be presenting the commendation, bringing their story full circle. On the day of the private ceremony, Thomas was joined by Margaret's sister Helen, who had flown in from Scotland, and by video link with Sarah and her family from Australia. As they entered the palace grounds through a special entrance reserved for honored guests, Thomas felt the weight of history and tradition surrounding him. The ceremony took place in one of the palace's smaller, but no less magnificent rooms, attended by military officials, representatives from veterans organizations, and members of the press who had been following their story. The atmosphere was formal but warm, dignified but deeply personal. When Lance Corporal Harrison approached Thomas, this time it was part of an official ceremony, but the emotion was no less genuine than their first encounter. Both men were visibly moved as James presented the commendation, a formal recognition of Thomas's service, sacrifice, and continued dedication to honoring fallen comrades. As he leaned down to pin the citation to Thomas's jacket, James said, quietly, "Thank you for showing me what real service looks like, sir. You've taught me more about being a soldier than any training manual ever could." Thomas's response was equally heartfelt. "No, son. Thank you for reminding an old soldier that his service still matters. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." The ceremony concluded with both men standing together for photographs, their mutual respect and the bond forged between them evident to everyone present. The images would become iconic, representing not just their individual stories, but the larger truth about service, sacrifice, and the importance of recognizing those who have given so much for their countries. The story of their encounter continued to inspire people long after the initial news cycle had moved on to other events. Veteran support groups around the world reported increased engagement, with more former servicemen and women reaching out for help, companionship, and community. The simple act of recognition had created a ripple effect that would benefit countless others. The image of the salute became a symbol that transcended national boundaries in military services, representing the universal respect and recognition that all veterans deserve. It appeared on fundraising materials for veterans' charities, in military academies, as an example of character and compassion, and in countless social media profiles as people shared their own connections to military service. For Thomas, the experience had given him something invaluable, not just recognition for his own service, but a renewed sense of purpose in helping other veterans who were struggling with their own battles. He began speaking at veterans events, sharing his story, and encouraging others to seek help and community when they needed it. He continued his annual visits to the palace, but now he wasn't alone. Word had spread through veterans' communities, and other former servicemen and women began joining him, creating an informal gathering that celebrated service and remembrance. What had started as one man's private ritual became a community of support and recognition. James Harrison continued his service with the Queen's Guard, but he carried with him the profound lesson that Thomas had taught him about the true meaning of military service. He became an advocate within his unit for reaching out to veterans, for understanding the continuing needs of those who had served, and for remembering that behind every uniform was a human being deserving of respect and recognition. Years later, when people asked Thomas about that October morning, he would smile and say, "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply acknowledge another person's worth." That young soldier gave me back my pride, my sense of belonging, and my understanding. That service to others never really ends. I hope our story reminds others that every veteran, every person who has sacrificed for something larger than themselves, deserves that same recognition and respect. The salute had lasted only seconds, but its impact would endure for generations. It became a reminder that in a world often divided by politics, nationality, and ideology, there are universal values, respect, dignity, service, and human compassion that unite us all. Most importantly, it demonstrated that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not on battlefields, but in quiet moments when one person chooses to see and honor the worth of another. Their story became a testament to the power of recognition, the importance of honoring service, and the truth that every veteran carries within them, stories of sacrifice that deserve to be acknowledged, remembered, and celebrated. In recognizing Thomas, James had honored all veterans. In responding with such grace and dignity, Thomas had reminded the world what true service looked like. The moment would be remembered not just for its emotional power, but for its reminder that the most profound gestures of respect often come not from grand ceremonies or official proclamations, but from one human being choosing to see, acknowledge, and honor another. In that simple exchange of salutes, two soldiers had created something beautiful and lasting, a bridge between generations, a symbol of enduring respect, and a moment of pure human connection that would inspire others for years to come.